Hello, Mrs. Palmer here. Just wanted to give you a few little tips for watercolour painting before you start today. So first thing I need my water. I need a paintbrush, a watercolour brush. I need my watercolour palette and whatever I'm going to be painting with or onto. So the first thing you need to remember is that watercolour paints work with water. They need to have water in order for them to move easily across the paper. They're not the same as paints that we would get from a tube. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make these individual colours slightly wet so they're ready to use. Now these little hard little bits here in your palette are called cakes. We need to make those a little bit wet before we use them. So you can see I've just started here already, but you need to do that by dipping your brush into the water, giving a little tap if you want to so you get some of the drips off, and then gently make this little cake wet. And you'll notice that as you do, you'll get some watery paint sitting on the top, and that's what you're going to use to paint. Now remember, watercolour paints are supposed to be a bit watery when you paint them. They're supposed to be faint colours. The more you paint your brush, the more you cover your brush, sorry, the slightly deeper the colour will be. Okay, the more water you have, the thinner the colour will become. Now when you're happy with the way that you've coated your paintbrush, you'll notice that I'm not scrubbing back and forth like this, because that will ruin the shape of my paintbrush and make it harder for you to paint. But when you're happy, lift your brush away and you can put your brush onto your paper, and you can use your brush on both sides. Try and go back and forth like this rather than scrubbing, to gently put and move your paint around the paper. Now I'll show you what I meant before by having more water is going to mean, and less paint is going to mean a slightly fainter colour. So this time I'm just going to dab it once or twice. You'll notice now that I've still got the same colour, but it's much, much fainter. So there's a few things for you to remember there. I can coat my paintbrush in more and more and more of this paint. It will never reach a very, 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 very deep colour, because that's not what watercolours are really used for. But the more paint I put on my brush, the slightly deeper my colour will become, okay? I need water in order for my paint to be able to move around on the paper. If I try it to do dry, it just won't work. I'll show you what I mean by, if I get a dry brush here, a dry cake here, doesn't matter how many times I do this, I'm not going to get any colour on my paper, okay? Now, this is nice and easy, of course, because I'm not painting into a shape. I'm just doing some nice colour washing. But what happens if I want to try and use watercolour paint and keep in the lines of something? So here is a little map of the UK, and I'm going to zoom into Wales. I'm going to show you how you can use the watercolour paint and the watercolour brush carefully enough so that you can paint within the lines and paint some detail. So I'm going to do the same as before. I've got to do this, dip my brush into my water, but this time I'm just going to use the edge of my brush on my jar and get rid of some of the excess of water. Okay, I'm going to go back to my very wet paint from before. I'm just going to dip the end of my brush gently into the paint, and you'll notice that the end of my paintbrush, see if you can see that, sorry it's not focusing very well, the end of my paintbrush is still that sharp point, and I'm going to use that sharp point, hold my brush like a pencil, I'm going to use that sharp point to carefully paint inside the lines, just like I would do with a pen or a pencil. Now remember, I need water in order to move my paint around. If I can see it's getting a bit wishy-washy, a bit too faint, then all I need to do is to dip back in my paint as before and load my brush up with a little bit more colour. Okay. Now I'm using the very tip of that paintbrush. If I put too much pressure on, it's going to be quite tricky for me to stay within the lines. So use the tip of the brush. Now equally, if the paint's stopping moving around so easily, that means you're going to have to dip back into your water, give it a little swish around, tap back on the end, gently rub it on the edge of the jar, go back into your paint and load your brush up again. Okay, now last thing before I go, I think you know how to do this now. Last thing before I go is you just need to remember that if you want a different colour, you must wash your brush first. If you don't, that wet paint from your brush and the wet cake by here will go onto another part of your palette. So dip it in, give it a little tap, just like before. And then here I'm going to use red, exactly like we did at the beginning. So making that extra cake, on your palette wet, because it won't work without it. Brushing your brush in the same direction, loading up your brush. There we go, and then I can paint another part of my map in a different colour using the point of my brush to get in all of those gaps. Okay, good luck.